Welcome to About Art. I'm Heidi Zuckerman. My guest today is someone who has radically expanded how we understand and experience art through listening. Tamar Avishai is the creator and host of The Lonely Palette, the award-winning podcast that returns art to the masses, one painting at a time. With deep knowledge and a gift for storytelling, Tamar makes centuries-old artworks feel newly alive, relevant, and personal. Her work as an art historian, educator, and audio producer includes partnerships with the National Gallery of Art, the Getty, the Wexner Center for the Arts, and many others. She's a founding member of the Hub and Spoke podcast collective, and her approach to making visual culture accessible is as generous as it is rigorous. Today, we'll talk about how audio can reshape the way we experience art, the value of slowing down, and the power of storytelling to shift what and how we see. Tamar, I'm so happy to be speaking with you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. I'd like to begin with the origin of The Lonely Palette. What was the spark that led you to start the podcast? And did you ever imagine how deeply it would resonate?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. No.
Yeah.
I had no idea that there were so many people out in the world like me who had, my experience was coming from an academic place where I was really, grad school, you're so rigorously going so deep into the discipline of art history, but like not even like your very specific little slice of it. And I kept wanting to, come out of the ivory tower and kind of have its feet touch the ground. And that was so frowned upon that I just gave up. I gave up, kind of having any pop culture references. Obviously I would never do that in a seminar paper, but even when I was giving a talk, it's like you want to kind of bring this very esoteric stuff back into real life, because of course it originates in real life. Artists are living in the world, but it didn't go over very well. So I thought that was a real moral and academic failing on my part. And when I left the academic world and I was really, really interested and excited about actually going into public radio and storytelling and audio production, somebody said, why not cut your teeth on an art history podcast just to kind of learn the ropes? And then, because that's what it's like, do what you know and then move on to the more professional side of things. And so I thought, okay, I'll make an art history podcast. And it turned out that what I had wanted to see more of in the academic world, the rest of the world did too. You would go into a museum and people were so scared to talk about art. They were so scared of being wrong. And they were so ripe to be plucked and brought into what makes this painting interesting, what makes a really good story, how they can find it accessible and relatable. And, I was lucky enough to have started the podcast in 2016 when there weren't as many. Mm-hmm. And it was just able to resonate in a way that was so exciting for me.
Yeah, I think it's such an incredible opportunity to be able to share with people something that you love. And just listening to your description of how, and I feel like things have changed a lot. It's 10 years since you've had the podcast, and everything in the world has changed so much. And certainly this idea of access has changed a lot. But there's certain things that still make people feel intimidated for whatever reason. One of them is art and the history of art. And I think you're getting at like a really core thing, which is like no one wants to feel dumb. And there was something about our field which was either intentionally or unintentionally designed to make people feel uncomfortable. And so you're helping kind of dispel some of those previously thought ideas of how you can look at and talk about art. So where did the title come from?
Well, let me just say though quickly, I agree, and I've been saying this forever, and I've been trying to kind of be really thoughtful about what I mean. I also agree that it's been intentionally made inaccessible, but I want to add the caveat that I don't think it's been maliciously made inaccessible.
Yes.
And I think that the two get tied up together, that this like secret shadowy cabal of curators are trying to kind of keep all of this to themselves. It's not like that at all. It's just the way that the academic world is structured. Again, you have to go so deep into your subject that you kind of forget what it's like for the rest of the world to experience this stuff. But the name, so it's kind of a combination of a few things. I was definitely working off of The Lonely Planet. This idea that, because I just been traveling Europe after college and, have my lonely planets that you actually like rip out the binding and tie together with a shoestring just to be cool. But, this idea of something that is overwhelming made accessible was The Lonely Planets. That's their thing. And so I wanted to jump on that. I was driving. This is a little cute story. I was driving to my dad's house. He lives in New Hampshire, and I was living in Boston at the time. And it was late at night, and my brother was already there. He's older than me. And, I was just kind of meeting up with him. And I was driving along on the highway at night, trucks passing. And I was like, The Lonely Palette. That's like evocative. That's okay. I like it. And I got to my dad's and I asked them, and I was like, what do you think about that? And my dad's first response, these are two intelligent people. My dad's first response was, well, it's not a food podcast. And my brother's response was, well, it's not a trucker podcast. And I was like, all right, you guys are no help at all. I'm going to ask my mom and my sister. And they liked it.
Yeah. It's funny. I didn't think of The Lonely Planet, maybe because I haven't used one of those guides in a long time, but it's great. And I had a book that came out last year, which I inverted the title of at the last minute. And what came to me was The Bearable Lightness of Being, which is obviously a play on the Milan Kundera, right? So these things from our youth that were guideposts for us or really helpful, and then the words just kind of stick in your head really forever.
Well, exactly. It does a lot of the lifting for you.
Yeah. And, just that slight kind of variation to it. But I do think this point of it not being maliciously exclusive is something that's important to come back to. And, what it underscores also is this idea that when you're so deep in something or so much about something, sometimes you forget that it's a special skill and not everyone has it. And that's something that we talk about a lot on this podcast, is that sometimes when people have knowledge or just have an inherent ability to be really good at something, they kind of take it for granted because they feel like, well, if I can do it, everyone must be able to do it. But that's not always the case.
I mean, that's just it. There's also a little piece of insecurity there where it's like they really have to assert that they know everything that they can, in order to play in the sandbox of the other experts. And so they'll end up inadvertently, kind of forcing a kind of superiority that maybe they don't even believe, but they feel like they have to. And then if you're the average Joe at the museum, you're like, whoa, like not only do I not know this, but this person really has to show me how much they know.
Yeah. So your tagline is bringing art history to the masses, one painting at a time, which I love. And I'm curious about, I guess, the assumptions about the general public's relationship to art that you were hoping to challenge or expand.
I mean, like I said, the way that the average person walks into a museum is not unlike actually the way that a fresh art history undergrad steps into the discipline. You assume that there is all of this meaning coming from these paintings and from this history and the way that they're presented and how a curator has chosen to put one painting next to another. Of course, the average museum goer doesn't even think about that, that the curator is kind of telling a story. But you walk up to these objects that feel so timeless, that feel like they've always been, and that they were put on Earth for you to walk through the space. You never really have any sense of how old these objects are. And you know that there's meaning, and you don't know, whether you're a visitor or an undergrad, how much of that meaning you're supposed to project, you're supposed to be able to interpret just by walking up to it and saying, do I like this, do I not like it? And how much exists out in the world that you just haven't learned yet. And art historians are always trying to walk that line. They tend to fall more on the history side of it. I mean, you interpret through the lens of history and movements and, academic literature. And then the museum visitor feels like, okay, what is this doing to me? What's my response to it? And is that enough? And because museums really want people to respond to these paintings, they'll say that that's enough, just to kind of validate the visitor. And there's that space in between that, you want visitors to have more confidence because they trust their instincts. They trust their interpretations because they have some background knowledge, because they have a little bit of the history kind of helping to guide them. And it just feels like
masses. So the assumptions about the general public's relationship to art that you were hoping to challenge.
Yeah. Well, exactly. That's what the general public walks in, and they either feel like they don't know anything about it, that it's not for them, that it was never meant to be for them, which couldn't be further from the truth. It's all for everybody.
Yeah.
And they feel like the museum space has kind of intimidated them into submission, which is not at all what the museum is trying to do.
Yeah, the opposite.
Yeah, especially now. I mean, that's changed so much in the last 20 years, never mind the last 40 years. And so where do you kind of stand, like at what intersection do you stand at between validating somebody's personal experiences and teaching them the history, and if you want to add kind of a third leg to the stool, talking about how the museum space affects you?
Yeah. Yeah.
When we talk about the masses, I've always hoped that that included anybody from hate art, this has nothing to do with me, fine, convince me, to art historians listening and saying, that's an interesting way of framing something I already knew about. And I've gotten positive responses from both sides.
Yeah, I would always say that one of my favorite things to do is to look at art with other people, because I learn something every time, because everyone sees things differently. And a big part of my approach has always been to encourage people to have an opinion and to, be open-minded and then to share, right? And there's no kind of it to get has been one of my approaches. When people say like, oh, you work with contemporary art, I don't get it. And I was like, guess what? There's no it. Yeah, that's like the big reveal, right? There's no it. So you talked,
which is very scary for people.
Actually,
that kind of makes the universe a little too big.
Let's talk about that for a minute. And I'm always really interested in where art and life come together, and I think that's why I care about art, is because it's my lens to not just look at art, but not just look at life, but kind of understand it. And sitting in that space of unknowing is something that I think is super fruitful, but not everyone's comfortable there.
Yeah, I agree. I think that.
So I don't know. I guess I want to talk a little bit more about that. What do you think are some of the benefits of being comfortable with discomfort? Or how does art help with that?
I mean, art, of course, is not any single thing. It's like saying marriage. Art is inhabited by the artist and the visitor or the viewer within that specific object. And the way that an artist is experiencing the world through a very, very subjective lens, because how else can one experience the world other than through their own subjective perspective? And then the visitor, the viewer, is taking something that they too can only experience through their own subjective perspective. And that friction point between the two is where the magic can happen. And it would be hubristic, I think, for any artist to think that they would be able to reach everybody. And it would be hubristic for a viewer to think that they know everything about this artist just based on this one object. But when the two connect, I think there's something very, very powerful, very unique about that connection. And sometimes that connection is really uncomfortable. I think that's how you know you're connecting, because it activates something in your lizard brain that says, I didn't want to be drawn to this, but here I am. This isn't just an object of beauty, or this isn't an object of beauty at all. This is something that has just gripped me, and it forces me to keep looking whether or not I want to or not. And so I think that sitting in that potential for discomfort, for disruption, I'd say disruption more than discomfort. That is probably the highest achievement an artist can have, is knowing that they've disrupted their viewer somehow. Whether it's by making, some very searing or poignant political commentary or commentary about the human experience, or because it's beautifully captured. You're walking by a Dutch painting and you see something with the level of detail that only could have been accomplished by an artist with a brush with a single hair. And you have to stop because you are so struck as a viewer that this thing was made by human hands. That in itself is disruption. And that, I think, is what you never know. You have to be open as the visitor to walk into a museum space and allow yourself, open yourself up to the potential for disruption. And I think we've kind of, this is a whole different subject and we don't have to go there. I've gone there a lot lately. I think we've kind of lost our taste for discomfort, and it's resulting in bad art.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. How do you define bad art?
I would define bad art as art that ultimately ends up being very inconsequential. Okay. Either because it is so derivative of something that's already been done that it just doesn't make a mark, even if it would have in a different generation. If you have to know your history as an artist. I would say something that is looking for an unearned payoff. I've seen artists who, by virtue of their fame, think that they can shortcut their way to a really powerful response by their visitor, and that annoys me. I feel like you should never, art is never about shortcuts. Something that I've found to be really interesting is, my mom is an artist, and I tried to be when I was younger, and it just never worked. I could never stop thinking about where I wanted to land, and it made me realize that that's actually a much better brain for a writer than for an artist, because a writer knows kind of where you want to go with your argument and then figures out how to get there. And is always kind of going back to the thesis and saying, okay, is this where I mean to go? Am I still, is the reader still with me? So that they feel like I'm guiding them towards a place that's going to have a kind of, narrative payoff. Artists, at least the ones that I've talked to, especially my mom, she'll just see where it takes her. She'll see where the materials take her and where the composition takes her and where it's kind of calling her to. And so I think when I see work by an artist who very clearly had an end in mind and just kind of used the art to get there, you can tell. And it feels like it was kind of unearned.
Yeah, it's shallow. It's interesting because, I talk about good curating and bad curating. I talked about it on a previous episode, and it's a very similar definition, which is, what's the impetus and what's the inspiration, what's the intention of the work that you're doing, and where does it come from? And if you're just trying to make a point and then you're picking art to try and make that point that you want to drive home, it doesn't have the possibility of transcendence, which is what drives me to art, is this opportunity to be removed from my here and now and to feel differently than I did before. Sometimes worse, sometimes better, but different. Usually better, but not always. And that is, I think, part of what we're kind of talking around is this abstract idea or knowledge of what art can do and what it can be. And when you know that it can be this incredible, revelatory, inspirational, aspirational, like everything, that it can be everything. And when someone chooses to just use that as a trope, it's bad, right? Mm-hmm. It feels bad, makes me feel bad, because I can tell. Okay, so just so you know, for whatever reason, the video is not recording, so we are just having an audio recording. So
okay.
It's okay.
It's recording on my side.
It is? Okay.
I think so. It might end up being okay. Sometimes, Riverside, sometimes these platforms will... You edit this, right? Like,
yes.
This will get...
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Just making sure. So, sometimes it's recording even though it isn't able to stream well enough to show it.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for your patience as I'm navigating through all this. Okay. So you often start each episode with someone who's encountering an artwork in real time, which I love. And
me too.
you kind of talked around this, but why do you think it's important to begin with the viewer's voice before your own?
God, this has turned out to be probably the biggest selling point for the show. I had no idea when I started. I was just kind of futzing around and I thought, it's audio of the visual. No one's going to buy that anyway, so I might as well have people describe what they see. And it turns out to be probably the most validating opening to an art history podcast imaginable. It was just this wonderful little serendipitous thing. When people, and they're not experts, very rarely will I talk to a curator because curators are not good at describing art. They're too deep. They zoom right in and they can't bring themselves to say that something looks like something else. They have to kind of articulate exactly what they're seeing. And that's not good tape. So I went to the museum. I asked people, describe what you see. Somebody looking at a Cezanne went off on how badly it was painted because those apples would have rolled off. Somebody said that a Mondrian reminded them of staring at a computer screen too long. Somebody described a Kandinsky as dropping a pile of like pickup sticks on the floor. And it's like you can even hear now, like your audience can hear now, like it's so evocative and it so is the thing, It's like if you then looked at these images, you would totally, your brain would have already made those connections. And that not only was a really effective tool for the ear to have, again, a crazy idea of a podcast about art, but it also was really, and this is the more important piece, it was really validating that somebody who doesn't know anything about art can pop on this podcast and know that it's totally okay that they see what this visitor sees and that I am not judging that it's totally okay to describe a Kandinsky as a dropped pile of pickup sticks. This is one of my favorites. It's totally okay to describe an Ansel Adams photograph. Somebody described it, and maybe this is very like New England specific where I'm from, but like when you peel the lid off a Hoodsie cup and it's that half and half white, like vanilla and chocolate ice cream that is like such a distinct line. And that's what she said. She was like, this photograph is so high contrast. All I can see is like the chocolate and vanilla.
Yeah.
And so that was a really great way to understand why his high contrast is so unique and resonant to his own style. Why there's a kind of organized chaos to a Kandinsky. Why there's an intentional, kind of vibrating flatness to a Mondrian. And so then the listener is like, okay, well, I get it. Like, I get that. Maybe I'll get this painting.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I think, again, it's the having permission, giving people permission to have an opinion and it validates what people are seeing and gets at that idea. There's no right, there's no wrong. It's just you and you're unique and your perspective is as valid as someone else's perspective. So
and that the expert who quote unquote, the quote unquote expert who, if there is a piece of this that is right or wrong, I mean, this painting did live, this artist did live in a context. Like you can't say that Manet lived in Song Dynasty China. I mean, right. There is a right answer here.
Yeah.
But here is the quote unquote expert giving me permission to, trust my own instincts as I'm going on this journey with her.
Yeah. I think the podcast form is really inherently intimate and also imaginative because it usually doesn't have video right now. Sometimes they do. We're trying to have video.
Yeah, let's pretend it doesn't. Nothing against anybody who's watching this right now, but as a podcaster, I prefer to stick to the audio piece of it.
Yeah, the sound, because what do you think sound can do for visual art that other formats can't? Museum text, books, even lectures.
Versus a lecture, I don't necessarily think, I mean, there's always something very powerful about the human voice. It is intimate, it's informal. You hear the emotion behind the speaker's every word, their inflection, what makes them laugh, what makes, what can be hard for them to say, or if you start to feel like that they're starting to have an emotional reaction to something. I mean, it's all in there. You can't hide it. And so, usually lecturers are reading something and they kind of go out of their way to keep the emotion out of their voice. But hey, I read off a script for I would never, I would never pretend that my episodes are extemporaneous. But what the podcasting medium has done that's different from print is it's made that I think is actually different from a lecture is that it has turned everything into a story. And I have 3 kids. They beg for me to read to them all the time. Everybody loves being told a story. And it's like enveloping to have a voice that you trust, guide you to a beginning, middle, and end. And I think that's what's made podcasting so big and so explosive over the last, 10, 15 years or so. But let's not pretend that radio hasn't always been, right, the medium that has drawn people in, and that before that, storytelling in the caves. I mean, this is not a new thing. But what's happened, I think, in the last decade and a half is that people start to trust a podcast to tell them a story about anything. Maybe I wouldn't necessarily sign up to go to my museum and go sit in on a lecture to do with this exhibition because it's just like not my jam. But if there's a podcast that's going to tell the story of this painting, sure, I'll bite. And I think there's a reason why history and, explanation podcasts have really taken off.
So interesting. Used to love listening to selected shorts on New York Public Radio, and it was on Sunday evenings, and I would plan my whole day around when I could then, sit and listen to being broadcast from somewhere in New York, but I would listen to it in my apartment. And
yeah, I would always make sure I was in the car at noon on Saturdays for This American Life so that I could drive around and listen.
Right. And just that idea, as you're saying, it's like being able to lose yourself in someone's voice. And those were read by incredible actors who would make the characters come to life. And it's such a great description and rationale for the appeal of this and the storytelling. And I do think this idea of companionship and connection is also a big part of it. And you're right, it is, you develop a trust. This person is going to offer me something that will be of interest to me, or that will help me pass the time, or will give me information that I didn't have before.
Yeah. And to your specific question about how art can benefit from the voice, it is not an easy pitch. I have pitched this show, I have pitched other art shows many, many times to many different kinds of networks. And there's very little imagination for how it could work, even though I can show them my show and say, hey, it works. Believe me, I have a good audience, like this works. I think we forget how much the visual just kind of elbows its way in. And you can have somebody stand in front of a painting and tell them the story of this painting, but people are going to be distracted by the painting itself. And I don't mean to say, obviously that's how it should be.
Yes.
But it's amazing what happens when you actually remove the visual of the painting from just have it be about, okay, so maybe artist biography, maybe social context, kind of flesh out the context in which this painting was created in, what it was responding to. All of that's interesting. It's nice to have somebody's full attention when you're telling that part of the story. But I do think, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about people's descriptions, people's kind of off-the-cuff descriptions, is that when they are imagining what the painting looks like, it's not necessarily a loss. If they're imagining based on descriptions either from the visitor at the top of the episode or mine throughout, it allows the listener to have a kind of sense of ownership because they have magicked this painting into existence based on really good, really thoughtful descriptions and how it's all part of the story. And I've had people tell me that they actually won't look at the painting until after the episode.
Yeah.
And kind of see how close they could get. And then once they actually see it, they just feel more connected to it because they imagined parts of it that ended up coming to fruition.
It's so interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, it's the appeal of the visual is so key, and it's one of the things that people have said to me over time too, where it's like people are listening, they don't know who these artists are, they don't know what the work looks like. It would be so great to show them the pictures, and I was like, they can go and look it up after, right? It's nice to be able to have a conversation where the image is absent, and if you're not looking at something, then as you said, your brain can imagine something, and then you can check it. But that encouragement for people to take the next step to foster creativity and curiosity. And I think that's one of the challenges of our contemporary time. You said something earlier about how people don't want to be uncomfortable and makes bad art. And I think people have lost their curiosity for anything that is different or separate or unexpected from them or their own experiences. And I think that's terrible.
Yeah. I think too that people tend to listen harder than they look. I think that because they have to.
Yeah.
Because you have to pay more attention when you're listening. And so that is as a podcaster, that's really special real estate. You know, like you have to respect that if to keep someone's attention requires a kind of a deft hand and good writing, you know, in the same way. That's another thing. People would always say, how could you possibly have a podcast about art and not necessarily see the image? And it's like, well, because for the same reason you can have a book without pictures. Right. It's about the writing and it's about the description.
You've created episodes for major institutions like SF MoMA, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and I'm curious how you adapt your voice and structure when you're working within an institutional framework.
Good question. Fortunately, I haven't had to too much. I've had a really kind of blessed experience where people hired me for my voice. If somebody doesn't want the way that I do it, they just don't hire me. And not because I'm pushy, but because museums are very, very conscious of their image, of the work that they put out into the world. So, you know, I'm never hired by the curator of an institution. I'm hired by their PR person. You know, they're the ones who are working on kind of bridging the connection between the museum and the public. And so any experience I've had with a museum that's kind of gone forward, they have said, okay, we want a Lonely Palette type treatment of this painting or this exhibition. And then largely they kind of leave me be, which is amazing.
Yeah. But it's interesting.
I've definitely had institutions say, like, we're not buying what you're selling.
Well, I mean, you do something specific, right? And actually both SF MoMA and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston have had very progressive directors who are very much interested in access and making people, the visitor, feel welcome and making the art open-ended instead of didactic. And that fits with what you're doing. And because you have a background in both academic and public-facing art education, right? And so what have you learned about bridging these two worlds? And where do you think they still resist each other?
It's changed a lot in the last 10 years, for sure. A lesson that I would have taken away in 2016 is different than I would take away in 2020 and what I would take away now.
Yeah.
I think that museums are a lot more open now to outside voices. It's kind of become part of their mission. There is conflict, there's a tension, and it's going to be a tension for at least another generation. I mean, I hate to put it in these terms, but until the older people retire or die and the next generation takes over. I'm not saying that's not going to be a loss. It's just the way it is, where there's going to be friction between the people who are making the decisions and the, social media people who are the ones who deal with the public in a very real way, where, curators put an exhibition together and they try to do it as thoughtfully as they can, but they have different priorities within themselves. One curator will have different priorities than another. one institution will have different priorities than another. Like, whatever, you have to make a decision at a certain point and just go. And you're always going to have responses online that say, well, why did you make this decision? Why'd you do that? That's so, colonialist, settler, whatever. I mean, there are people who believe that museums themselves are a crime against humanity. Yeah. And that is a very overly simplistic way of looking at museum spaces. But the door has been opened to let those voices in. And so that, I wouldn't have said museums shouldn't do that. I'm sure their lives would be easier if they didn't. But in that complication, they then have to say, okay, well, how are we going to use our collection in a thoughtful, inclusive way? That doesn't mean that the social media voices should get all the attention either, because they're not experts in this stuff. They're not thinking deeply the way that the curators are. So, that tension is not going away anytime soon. I think that museums are trying very, very hard to address it. And, the younger people, it's, this is what happens. Like, younger people take older people's jobs, but they're older by the time they do, and they see both sides.
Yes.
And so it's a slow move of the tanker.
Yeah. Well, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, where people are uncomfortable sometimes in a space of complexity. And one of the things that, I've learned over time is that different, seemingly disparate things can both simultaneously be true. When I think you're younger, you think that it either has to be one way or the other way. But actually, you can hold space for contrast and complexity and contradiction, because all things are actually true all at the same time. So again, one of the reasons why I like art, because it creates that space for openness and, confusion and grace and humor and beauty and truth, and all these kind of big things are encapsulated for me in art in a way that they're just not anywhere else in society. So I think your work reveals how art is a mirror for our inner lives. That's what we're talking about, and also for our cultural values. And I'm curious how researching and writing about specific works of art has changed your understanding of them in surprising ways. And maybe you could tell a story about a specific work and a surprise within that process for you.
I've said this before, that it's very hard to not fall in love a little bit with every object that crosses your path that you're gonna do a deep dive into. You kind of, you like get it more. And so I think that it's always really eye-opening to recognize that whether a painting is extremely well known or not known at all, and whether I think I knew something about it or I didn't know anything about it, that understanding where the artist was coming from, in so much as we can, has been, it's like you feel like you've made a new friend with that artist. You feel like this is their offering out into the world, and this is what they do in order to show the world who they are and how they're responding to something that's going on in their lives. And you always think, like, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for taking the time to do this. Mary Kelly, thank you for documenting 5 solid years of your son's babbles and diaper linings and every little trinket he handed you. And, some people might say that was obsessive and a little insane. And yet, when I was a new mother, I found that to be very comforting. Yeah. I felt those impulses. I questioned what you questioned. I felt seen in a way. It made me realize how much I judged you before that until it really broke open what you were doing. And that was a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of work to make me feel seen for when I came around to it. So thank you. It was just there waiting for me to discover. That's a real kindness that artists are doing. And we have to be open to what they've created and to, they want us to relate to it. They want us to. And I think that that's also something that we're not taught. There's the whole kind of velvet rope around around museums, around paintings, you can't go too close. You know, if you haven't studied this, it's like it's not your, you're not permitted. And that, what I've learned in the course of making this podcast is how deeply artists want to be known and seen, and how much they want their artwork to be received.
Yeah.
And so I take such pleasure now in receiving it, even if I don't want to. I'm working on a piece on Dolly right now. I don't think I like him very much.
Yeah.
He's famous, he's a big deal, and I've never really studied him. And it's like, ugh, I don't love him, but I'm trying to get him.
Yeah.
Although his whole thing was eluding, being gotten. And maybe that's what's irritating me about him.
That's a great segue to the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is the question that everyone asks me if they're brave enough, which is, how do you choose which artworks you feature and what makes a piece worth an episode?
It's totally happenstance. Sometimes I look at the buffet of art history and I just think, I haven't done something like that in a while. Why not? This feels just different enough to make it seem like I have diverse offerings. This is something that's interesting to me that I've always meant to dive into. I was in this state for a wedding and I went to this museum oh, I've got tape there. Yeah. Okay, sure. It's entirely by feel. It's never been more than that. I wish I had more of a formula there, but it's just sure, why not?
Well, I think that actually defines creativity and is the difference, right, between good podcasting and bad podcasting, or good creativity and bad creativity, right? Which is being able to be open to, the muse or wherever inspiration comes from. So as someone who has made people feel more comfortable looking at art, what advice do you have for those who feel intimidated or unprepared or unsure of their own reactions? What would you tell people?
Stand in front of an object for longer than you're comfortable with. Resist the urge to walk away. Just stand there for a little while. And look for things in it that remind you of other things. Things that are familiar. I was at, this kind of betrays just the headspace I'm in, because I'm a youngish mom. I'm not young, but my kids are. Where there was a painting that I walked by that it was just kind of a black and white abstract, beautiful. It was at the Met in New York, and I don't know, just the way that it was painted, it looked like it had been kind of smeared with a palette brush, and there was just something about the way that there would be kind of this cake icing sense of smear that was really beautiful. And then I looked at it and it looked so much like a sonogram to me that I just kind of fell into it for a little while. And it was not, then I read the wall text and it was by a man, so it wasn't a sonogram. But yeah, I was just amazed at how much I had been grabbed just because it just reminded me of something. And I will totally, this was at least 6 years ago, but if I go back to the Met, I'll totally look for that painting. I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah. Well, that speaks to the power of memory and what reminds us of someone. And sometimes people talk about smell or taste, but images can take us back to a different place. And
sound.
Again, sound for sure. Probably sound and smell the most, right? But yeah, I love that description. So, all right. So a painting that you keep returning to no matter how many times you've studied it.
If I'm at the MFA, I have to see the Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd.
A museum that you think everyone should visit at least once.
Not an art museum, actually. The Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. The best history museum, bar none, certainly in the United States.
Great. An artist whose story you feel more people should know.
Mary Kelly.
A non-art podcast that inspires the way you think about structure or storytelling.
Ooh. John Ronson's Things Fall Apart.
Good. Okay. A place you go physically or imaginatively for reflection.
When you walk into an art museum and you're just in that kind of large atrium space, usually there'll be some sort of waterfall or something there.
That's awesome. Three more. A work that made you cry or laugh unexpectedly.
Unfortunately, cry. At SF MoMA, I did an episode on these. Anselm Kiefer's Shulamit and Margareta, not just because of the, kind of knowing the story of them, but you really do, especially Shulamit, you fall into it in a really very uncomfortable way.
To be discussed and unpacked at another point, too.
My God, anytime.
Okay. One thing you wish more people understood about art history?
It's the job of academics to go down a very, very, very deep well that they're already like 50 feet underground by the time you come to it. So don't assume that it started there.
Okay. And why does art matter?
Same reason why humans matter, to tell each other our stories.
Oh, good. Thank you so much for your time today. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
This was a pleasure.